So, picture this. It's 1793, right?
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah, and you have this 24-year-old artillery officer. He's stationed on this completely culturally isolated island in the Mediterranean.
Right.
And, he speaks this really broken French. Like, he has a heavy accent that people actually mock him for.
It was definitely not a Parisian insider, that's for sure.
Exactly. Zero aristocratic pedigree.
Yeah.
I mean, he's incredibly short on cash and completely disconnected from all the elite power centers in Paris.
Right, he's basically a nobody in the grand scheme of things.
Completely. I mean,
Yeah.
by all the traditional laws of history, this guy's ceiling is, at best, a mid-level regional commander.
Yeah.
Someone who just gets completely forgotten by time.
Yeah, a footnote in a textbook.
Exactly. But then, less than a decade later, this exact same man is the emperor of Europe.
It's wild to even think about.
Right. He's commanding this military force that just utterly terrifies the monarchs of the world. So for you listening today, the question is, how does a complete outsider just, hijack an entire continent?
It really is the ultimate historical anomaly. I mean, when you look at the titans of history, the absolute conquerors, you usually see this very linear, predictable progression.
Like they were born for it.
Exactly. They're born into royalty, they're groomed from birth, and, they have the wealth of an entire nation behind them from day one.
Right. You look at their resume and think, well, yeah, obviously they ended up on a throne.
Exactly. But with Napoleon Bonaparte, that entire predictable resume is just shredded.
Just thrown out the window.
Totally. And if you approach his rise purely through, the traditional lens of military history,
Like just looking at the battles and stuff.
just plotting out troop movements, calculating supply lines, or analyzing 19th century weaponry, you are going to completely miss the actual magic trick.
Which, honestly, is the core mission of our deep dive today. We're exploring this really curated stack of sources. We've got historical analyses, letters, tactical breakdowns, all to decode what is essentially Napoleon's psychological playbook.
Because it really was a psychological game.
It was.
Mm-hmm.
And the central thesis we need to establish right here, right off the bat, is that Napoleon didn't just win wars on physical battlefields. He won them in the minds of his enemies before, a single musket was ever even fired.
Yeah, he fundamentally understood that the entrenched monopolies of his time, so the European aristocracy and the military elite, they were playing this rigid, centuries-old game.
Right, heavily based on tradition.
Exactly. It was all about pedigree and having overwhelming static resources. And Napoleon's ultimate leverage was recognizing, hey, I can never beat them at that specific game.
So he just changed the rules.
He changed the underlying mechanics of the conflict itself. He weaponized psychology, he weaponized speed and perception to just create a completely new paradigm.
The analogy that keeps jumping out from the notes, and I love this, is comparing him to an obscure modern startup founder.
Oh, it's a perfect comparison.
Right. Imagine a guy with zero industry connections who just walks into a trillion-dollar industry dominated by these massive, sluggish monopolies, and he just completely bankrupts them.
And not by outspending them either.
No, not by having a bigger budget, but by playing a fundamentally different psychological game.
Right.
But, to understand how he manipulated the minds of his enemies on that massive scale, we first have to look at how he physically manipulated the battlefield.
To induce that absolute panic, yeah.
Exactly. We have to talk about the corps d'armée.
Yeah, the corps d'armée. Because the physical tactics were absolutely the delivery mechanism for the psychological warfare.
Okay, so break that down for us.
Well, to understand the innovation of the corps d'armée, you first have to really grasp the agonizing reality of a traditional European army before Napoleon came along.
Agonizing is a good word for it.
It really was. We are talking about tens of thousands of men moving as a single lumbering entity.
I always picture them like this massive, slow-moving cargo ship.
A cargo ship is a really good visualization for the size. But to understand why they move so slowly, you have to look at the psychology of the traditional soldier back then.
Okay, so what were they like?
Well, prior to the French Revolution, European armies were largely made up of, mercenaries, conscripts, and men who were just pressed into service.
So they didn't want to be there.
Not at all. They had absolutely zero personal investment in the war. I mean, they fought because they were paid to, or because they were just terrified of their own aristocratic officers.
Wow. So trust between the leadership and the soldiers was like virtually non-existent.
Exactly, zero trust. The prevailing military doctrine was that a concentrated force is a safe force. But the hidden truth there was that if you split a traditional army up into smaller groups.
Like if you sent them out on their own.
Yeah, if you sent them out of the direct line of sight of the generals, a massive percentage of those men would just simply desert.
Wait, they would just leave?
Literally, they would just walk away into the woods and go home.
That's crazy.
So because of that intense fear of desertion, the entire army had to march together in one giant, massive block.
Right, to keep an eye on everyone.
Exactly. And because they were so massive, they were incredibly slow. I mean, they could only move a few miles a day.
So they were totally predictable.
Very. You always knew where the enemy's cargo ship was, and you knew exactly how many days it would take them to turn around.
Okay, so the bottleneck wasn't just logistical, getting food and stuff. It was a fundamental lack of trust in the workforce.
Precisely.
But then Napoleon steps into this post-revolutionary France. And the men fighting for him, they aren't just mercenaries anymore, right?
No, they are citizens. They are fighting for the survival of their new republic.
Right, so that ideological shift was the catalyst.
Exactly. Napoleon looked at these highly motivated soldiers and realized, hey, I don't need to keep them in a giant prison ship. I can actually trust them.
Wow.
So he took this massive lumbering army and completely shattered it into smaller, highly mobile, and crucially independent units.
The corps d'armée.
That's the corps d'armée.
So he essentially traded the cargo ship for, like, a coordinated fleet of speedboats.
That's a great way to put it.
But how were these speedboats actually structured? Like, when we say independent, what does that actually look like on the ground in the early 1800s?
Right. So each of these corps was essentially a miniature, self-contained army.
Okay, how miniature are we talking?
Typically ranging from, say, 15,000 to 30,000 men.
Still a lot of guys.
It is, but compared to 100,000, it's nimble. And each corps had its own infantry, its own cavalry for scouting and shock attacks, its own artillery, and its own supply train.
So they didn't need to rely on the main hub.
Exactly. Because they were smaller, they could march significantly faster, sometimes up to 20 or 30 miles a day.
Which is huge compared to the cargo ship.
Massive difference. And because they were self-contained, they could engage an enemy and survive completely independently for about 24 to 48 hours.
Okay, but this is where I have to look at the strategic risk here, because honestly, it seems terrifyingly vulnerable.
How so?
Well, if I'm, let's say, an Austrian general, right, and I have a traditional concentrated army of 80,000 men,
Yeah.
and I see one of Napoleon's isolated corps of just 20,000 men marching toward me, I'm going to just crush it with my full weight.
Right.
I mean, doesn't splitting up your forces like that just allow the enemy to pick you off piece by piece?
It is a perfectly logical question, and it's the exact trap the old guard generals fell into.
They thought the same thing.
They did. They calculated the risk based on the traditional rules of speed. They assumed that if they engaged one of these smaller corps, they would have days or even weeks to destroy it before French reinforcements could arrive.
But they were wrong.
Very wrong. The magic of the corps d'armée wasn't just in the division of troops, it was in the synchronization of their movement.
But wait, how do you synchronize something like that over hundreds of miles of European countryside? I mean, they didn't have radios.
No radio.
They didn't have GPS. How does the left hand know what the right hand is doing?
Through a relentless, obsessive focus on mathematics, topography, and communication networks.
Really? Mathematic.
Oh, yeah. Napoleon maintained a massive central staff of cartographers and dispatch writers. He would calculate the exact marching pace of each corps over specific types of terrain.
So he knew exactly where they would be at any given hour.
Exactly. He would spread these corps out across multiple parallel roads, essentially sweeping across the country like a giant net.
Oh, wow.
And this completely confused the enemy. The Austrians or the Prussians would see dust clouds on 3 different horizons. They had absolutely no idea where the main French attack was coming from.
So what do?
They would hesitate. They would freeze up.
And while they are frozen, trying to figure out which speedboat is the real threat.
While they are frozen, the trap closes. Once the enemy's main force was located by the cavalry, the orders would go out.
Right.
The independent corps, which were marching perhaps a day's march apart from each other, would suddenly wheel inward. They would converge on the enemy's position from multiple directions with just devastating speed.
So, going back to my earlier point, the Austrian general with 80,000 men might engage a French corps of 20,000.
Yes, but that French corps only had to hold the line for a few hours.
Because the speedboats are all rushing in.
Exactly. Because by the afternoon, another French corps is hitting the Austrian right flank, and by evening, a third corps is appearing in their rear.
Man, it's the sheer velocity that creates the panic.
Absolute panic.
The enemy general goes to sleep thinking he's fighting this small detachment, and he wakes up to find an entire empire crashing down on him from 360 degrees.
It induced total psychological paralysis. And, this brings us to the philosophical core of his entire strategy. There's a quote from the sources that perfectly encapsulates his worldview.
Let's hear it.
Napoleon said, "Space we can recover, time never."
Okay, space we can recover, time never. Let's really analyze the mechanics of that because it demands a total inversion of how we normally think about conflict.
It really does.
In a traditional military context, space is everything, right? It's the territory. It's holding the high ground, defending the fortress, protecting the border. The old guard was just obsessed with static assets.
The 18th century way of war was essentially this polite game of territorial acquisition. Armies would spend months maneuvering just to capture a single border town, and then they would stop and negotiate.
Like, we got the town, let's talk.
Exactly. But Napoleon realized that territory is an illusion if you don't have the momentum to hold it.
Right.
You can lose a piece of land today, and if your army is intact and moving fast, you can win it back tomorrow. But time is momentum. Time is the initiative.
And once you lose that,
if you surrender the initiative, if you give the enemy time to breathe, time to organize their thoughts, time to dig defensive trenches, you can never get that time back.
So by prioritizing time over space, he kept his enemies in a state of constant, desperate reaction.
Always on the back foot.
Yeah, like they were playing this thoughtful game of classical chess, and he was playing speed chess while actively kicking their pieces off the board.
That is a perfect analogy.
By the time an enemy general had drawn up, a beautiful textbook plan to counter Napoleon's current position, Napoleon wasn't there anymore. The plan was obsolete before the ink was even dry.
The historical records are full of accounts from Allied generals who were just genuinely bewildered. They felt like they were fighting a phantom.
Wow.
And this prioritization of time over space, this reliance on small, autonomous, highly capable units, it's not just a relic of military history.
No, it's incredibly relevant today. I mean, when I read the breakdown of the Corps d'Armée in the notes, my mind immediately went to modern corporate structures.
Oh, absolutely.
This 19th century military tactic is the absolute historical prototype for modern agile methodology in the business world.
The parallels are striking when you look at how traditional legacy corporations operate versus, innovative startups.
All right, let's define the terms for a second for the listener. A massive legacy corporation is the old Austrian army.
Right.
It has a staggering budget, tens of thousands of employees, and immense market share. That's their territory.
Yep, their space.
But because everything has to go through like 20 layers of middle management, legal review, and compliance, it takes them 4 quarters just to approve a minor update to their product. They are a slow-moving cargo ship obsessed with defending their current space.
And the agile startup is the Corps d'Armée. Modern tech companies don't build massive monolithic departments anymore. They use what they call scrums or sprints, right?
Yeah, working in intense short cycles.
Exactly. They build small, cross-functional, autonomous squads. You put a software developer, a UX designer, and a product manager into one small team. You give them a clear objective, and you trust them to execute.
Just like Napoleon giving a corps commander his own infantry, cavalry, and artillery and saying, hey, go take that bridge.
Exactly. And these modern squads can iterate, test, fail, and deploy a new feature in 2 weeks. They prioritize time over space.
Because they know that speed of execution and just maintaining momentum in the market is vastly more important than making sure the first draft of the code is absolutely flawless.
But there is a crucial human element required for this to work in both 19th century warfare and modern business.
Right. It's not just about the structure.
No, you cannot just hand a group of people a new organizational chart, declare them an autonomous squad, and expect them to perform miracles. The strategy of extreme speed requires extreme, almost irrational confidence.
Because if they panic, the whole thing falls apart.
Exactly. If the soldiers in those isolated corps hesitated, if they got scared and decided to wait for reinforcements, the velocity drops to 0. the synchronization fails. The entire strategy collapses.
So the speedboats only work if the people driving them believe they are unsinkable.
That's right.
So where does that level of blistering confidence come from? Because, I mean, you're dealing with exhausted, freezing teenagers who are being shot at with literal cannons. You can't just give them a pep talk.
No, the confidence didn't come from a tactical manual or a motivational speech. It was directly, viscerally transferred from the leader's psychology.
Okay, transfer how?
It came from the deliberate cultivation of what we can call a bulletproof ego. Napoleon understood that the emotional state of his army was his most vital resource, way more important than gunpowder or rations.
And he cultivated this through immense physical risk, didn't he? The notes highlight his strategic decision to frequently place himself right at the front lines of combat, particularly in his early campaigns.
Yeah, and from a purely mathematical military perspective, it is absolute lunacy.
Total lunacy. I mean, you are the commander-in-chief, you are the supreme architect of the battle, you are the single most valuable asset on the continent. You do not ride your horse into the effective range of enemy grape shot.
Right. If a stray piece of shrapnel hits you, the empire is over. It defies logic.
It defies tactical logic completely.
It does, but it is the absolute pinnacle of emotional intelligence.
Okay, unpack that. How is risking your life emotional intelligence?
Well, emotional intelligence isn't just about being soft or empathetic, right? It is about deeply, clinically understanding the emotional state of the people you lead and knowing exactly what specific input is required to alter that state.
Okay, I see.
Napoleon knew his men were vastly outnumbered. They were hungry and they were terrified. He knew that the only input powerful enough to override the primal human instinct to run away from gunfire was the visual proof of his own absolute fearlessness.
So it wasn't just raw, adrenaline-fueled bravery on his part. It was a highly calculated performance.
It's entirely calculated. There are famous instances like at the Battle of Lodi or Arcole in Italy, where his men were refusing to cross a bridge under heavy, concentrated Austrian fire.
It was basically a choke point.
A deadly choke point. The momentum was dying. The tactical plan was failing. Napoleon didn't send a messenger with a louder order.
What did he do?
He physically grabbed a flag, walked to the front of the column, and stepped onto the bridge himself.
Wow. I mean, imagine being a 19-year-old conscript in that exact moment.
Right.
You were paralyzed by fear, watching the men next to you get torn apart by artillery. And then you look over, and the commander of the entire army, the genius, who has engineered every victory, is just standing in the kill zone, completely unfazed. What does that do to your brain?
It completely shorts out your fear response. It communicates a few things simultaneously. First, it triggers intense shame.
Like, how can I hide in the mud when the general is standing in the open?
Exactly. And second, it creates an illusion of invincibility. It projects this reality distortion field.
Okay, what is the psychological reasoning there for the soldier?
The soldier's brain goes, if he is not terrified, the danger must not be as real as I think it is, or he knows something I don't know, or we are simply destined by God to win.
He didn't just command the army, he basically infected them with his own ego.
He did.
The men developed this deep, genuine conviction that they literally could not lose a battle as long as he was physically breathing the same air as them on the battlefield.
The impact of this psychological transfer was so potent, so measurable in terms of combat effectiveness, that his enemies actually put a mathematical value on it.
Wait, a mathematical value? How?
Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington.
The guy who eventually beats him at Waterloo.
Yes, he made a very famous assessment. He stated that Napoleon's mere presence on a battlefield was the equivalent of adding 40,000 extra troops to the French army.
That number is just staggering.
Yep.
40,000 men. We are talking about the psychological output of a single human being carrying the weight of an entire army corps.
It is the ultimate proof that the war is won in the mind. The morale boost to his own men, who fought with almost demonic intensity because he was watching, combined with the sheer paralyzing terror it struck into the enemy commanders who realized he is here, he is looking at us, literally shifted the balance of power on the continent.
It operates like a human buff spell in a video game.
Exactly like that.
But looking at this objectively, analyzing the architecture of this leadership style, isn't this the ultimate double-edged sword?
How do you mean?
Well, if the morale, the speed, and the sheer operational capacity of hundreds of thousands of men relies entirely on the perceived invulnerability of one single guy, aren't you just building an organization with a massive, glaring single point of failure?
Yes. You have identified the tragic, fatal flaw in this archetype of charismatic leadership.
It seems so fragile.
Because it is. When an entire system, an entire empire, is built not on robust institutions or shared governance, but solely on the magnetism and the bulletproof ego of a single founder, the organization becomes incredibly brittle.
Because the confidence of the troops wasn't in the French Republic or in the tactical brilliance of the other generals serving under him. Their confidence was purely in the man himself.
Right.
So what happens if he gets sick? What happens if he makes a legitimately bad call and an entire corps gets wiped out? If the illusion of invincibility gets cracked, the whole house of cards has nothing structural keeping it up.
Exactly. And the historical record shows that his marshals and generals, when left to command on their own without him present, frequently struggled.
Really? Even his top guys?
Yeah. They had been trained to execute his brilliance, not to replicate his aura. The fragility of this system is something we will see play out in devastating detail when we look at his eventual downfall.
Right.
But for over a decade, the illusion held tight. And the reason it held wasn't just because of his insane physical bravery on the battlefield. It was because he mastered the art of amplifying and scaling that bravery off the battlefield.
Okay, this is a perfect pivot. Because cultivating invincibility for the 10,000 guys standing right in front of you, the guys who can physically see you holding the flag on the bridge, is one thing.
Right, that's immediate.
But how do you project that invincibility to a rival king sitting in a palace 800 miles away? How do you keep millions of citizens in Paris believing in the myth when you are off fighting in Egypt or Austria? I mean, he couldn't physically be everywhere. He needed a mechanism to scale his aura.
And to solve that problem of scale, Napoleon essentially became the world's first modern influencer.
I found it so striking that the sources explicitly draw that parallel. It sounds completely anachronistic, but it is precisely what he was doing.
It really is.
He was manufacturing a highly controlled, deeply intentional brand long before the concept of public relations or corporate branding even existed.
He understood implicitly that reality is largely irrelevant. Perception is reality. He didn't just win battles and hope the newspapers wrote nice things about him.
No, he controlled the narrative.
Exactly. He specifically commissioned and directed the best artists, writers, and sculptors of the era to craft meticulous visual propaganda. He didn't want accurate portraits. He wanted mythological icons.
And the ultimate manifestation of this is Jacques-Louis David. He was essentially Napoleon's chief marketing officer, right?
He was. Jacques-Louis David was a master of neoclassical art, and his painting, Napoleon Crossing the Alps, is perhaps the most successful piece of personal branding in human history.
Okay, let's pull that image up in our minds, because for you listening, even if you don't know art history, you know this painting.
Everyone has seen it.
Napoleon is sitting on this magnificent, wild, rearing, white Arabian warhorse. His vibrant red cape is whipping dramatically in the freezing alpine wind. He is holding the reins with one hand, looking perfectly calm, almost serene, while pointing upward and onward toward the mountain peaks and, implicitly toward victory.
It is the absolute visualization of the bulletproof ego. It projects power, control over nature, and divine destiny.
Right.
But here is where the critical historian steps in. The event depicted in that painting is entirely manufactured. It is a lie.
A total fabrication.
When Napoleon actually crossed the Alps to invade Italy, he did not ride a rearing Arabian stallion. He crossed the Alps on a mule.
A mule.
Yes.
The great emperor of Europe conquering the mountains on a donkey.
Exactly. Because if you are actually trying to navigate treacherous, icy, narrow mountain passes in the freezing cold, a giant skittish warhorse is a massive liability.
That makes total sense, yeah.
Mules are sure-footed. They are stubborn, but they won't slip and fall off a cliff. The reality was a slow, grueling, freezing, miserable trek led by a local peasant guide.
But you cannot build an aura of invincibility. You cannot terrify the Austrian emperor by distributing a painting of a guy looking cold and exhausted on a mule.
Right. Napoleon shivering on a mule does not scale. It doesn't inspire a nation.
It absolutely does not.
So the painting was never meant to be a documentary record. It was an emotional brand asset. He was very carefully constructing a specific narrative. He wanted to be viewed as a hero who bends the forces of nature to his will. And crucially, he was using this art to avoid the optics of a tyrant.
That's a really fascinating distinction. What is the visual difference between a hero and a tyrant in propaganda?
Well, a tyrant is depicted through fear and opulence. A tyrant forces compliance through the threat of violence.
Like, do what I say or I'll crush you.
Exactly. But a hero inspires compliance through awe. If you look at that painting, he isn't threatening the viewer. He is inviting the viewer to follow him into greatness. He's projecting an aura that makes people want to submit their will to his, which is infinitely more powerful than forcing them to do it at gunpoint.
That is so smart. And his mastery of branding went far beyond just commissioning grand oil paintings. It bled into his everyday physical presentation. I really want to unpack the specific details of his personal branding because they are iconic. The bicorn hat and the hand tucked inside the waistcoat.
Yes, these are master strokes of visual shorthand and communication.
I have to admit, looking at this with a modern lens, it seems almost absurd.
It does a bit, doesn't it?
Right, wearing a funny-looking felt hat sideways and constantly walking around with one hand shoved into your shirt. If a CEO or politician adopted a specific quirky physical pose today and just held in every single photograph, they'd be turned into a meme in 5 minutes. People would relentlessly mock them.
Oh, without a doubt.
So why didn't people just laugh at him back then? Why was it so devastatingly effective?
Well, to understand why it wasn't mocked, you have to look at the mechanics of the environment he operated in and the historical resonance he was tapping into.
Okay, let's start with the hat.
Right. The bicorn hat was actually standard military issue for officers of the era, but traditionally an officer wore it with the points facing forward and backward, parallel to the shoulders.
Like a normal hat.
Right, but Napoleon deliberately chose to wear his en bataille, which means sideways, with the points facing left and right.
Why? Just to be contrarian?
No, for visibility. Think about the physical reality of a 19th century battlefield. It is chaotic. There are tens of thousands of men, and once the cannons and muskets start firing, the entire field is choked with thick, black, sulfurous smoke.
You probably couldn't see a thing.
You cannot see faces from more than 50 yards away, but you can see silhouettes. By turning that hat sideways, he created a completely distinct, unmistakable visual silhouette. It acted as a beacon through the smoke.
Oh, wow.
When his troops, who were getting battered and exhausted, looked through the fog of war and saw that specific silhouette on a ridgeline, they instantly knew the bulletproof ego was on the field. The brand was instantly recognizable from a mile away.
That is incredible. It's exactly like a modern corporate logo.
Absolutely.
It's the 19th century equivalent of the Nike swoosh, but made of beaver pelt and worn on a guy's head amidst literal cannon fire. It communicates everything you need to know in a fraction of a second.
A perfect analogy.
And what about the hand tucked into the waistcoat? Because that wasn't just like a random nervous tick or a way to keep his hand warm.
Not at all. Napoleon was a student of history, and he modeled much of his empire's aesthetic on classical antiquity. In ancient Greece and Rome, inserting a hand inside the tunic was a recognized pose in portraiture and oratory.
Really?
Yeah. The Greek statesman Aeschines famously claimed that speaking with the arm outside the toga was ill-mannered. It became this classical symbol of a leader who is calm, modest, rational, and in complete control of their emotions.
Wow. So he is subconsciously hacking the minds of the educated elite in Europe. He is visually linking himself to the great emperors of Rome and the philosophers of Greece.
Precisely. It projected absolute composure. While everyone else around him is panicking, screaming orders, and losing their minds over the chaos of a campaign, the emperor is so relaxed, so completely in control of the situation that he just has his hand tucked away.
Just chilling.
Exactly. It reinforces the emotional intelligence we discussed earlier. He knew that projecting a serene, almost detached calm was the most infectious and reassuring thing he could do for his followers.
Think about how you present yourself at work or in your own business. There is a massive practical lesson here about the power of visual shorthand and consistency. Napoleon didn't change his aesthetic to chase trends.
Never.
He wore the exact same uniform of a colonel of the chasseurs à cheval, the same hat, the same pose, day after day, year after year.
Because it creates a cognitive anchor for people. And we see the exact same strategy utilized by the most influential founders of our era.
Like who?
Well, Steve Jobs in the black turtleneck. Mark Zuckerberg in the plain gray t-shirt. They didn't do that because they lacked fashion sense. They did it to eliminate friction. They created a distinct, consistent visual silhouette.
Right. When you see the black turtleneck, you don't have to spend any mental energy figuring out who that is. your brain immediately skips to the concepts of innovation, sleek design, and Apple.
Exactly. And when the French army saw the sideways hat, their brains immediately skipped to concepts of speed, invincibility, and victory.
So for you listening, ask yourself, what is your bicorn hat? It doesn't have to be a piece of clothing. It could be a specific, calm tone of voice you use when a project is failing.
Or a unique, rigorous framework you always bring to strategy meetings.
Right. It's about building a consistent behavioral or visual shorthand that tells your team who is in the room and what emotional state they should be adopting.
It is a profoundly powerful tool. But, as with all systems built entirely on the sheer force of human will and extreme self-belief, we really must examine the physical limits of that reality distortion field.
Because eventually, the force of reality pushes back.
It always does.
Which brings us to the inevitable collapse. A brand built on constant, frantic speed, relentless rule breaking, and an illusion of absolute invincibility is a juggernaut. Right up until the system hits a wall that it cannot outmaneuver. You can manipulate the minds of men, but you cannot outbrand winter.
No, you absolutely cannot. We have to analyze the logistical and tactical failures of his later years because the exact same psychological traits that built the emperor, the speed, the ego, the refusal to accept traditional limits, were the precise instruments of his destruction.
Let's talk about the absolute nightmare that was the Russian campaign of 1812. The sources make it super clear that this wasn't just a stroke of bad luck or bad weather. It was the direct, fatal result of his specific psychology hitting a geographical limit.
Right. When you build an entire career on moving fast, breaking things, and ignoring the traditional boundaries of what is considered possible, you are relying on an unreasonable, almost pathological level of confidence.
And for 15 years, that confidence paid off massively.
It was heavily rewarded. But extreme self-belief has a very thin, very porous border with outright delusion.
And crossing the Niemen River into Russia is where he crossed that border into delusion. I mean, he invaded Russia with the Grande Armée, over 600,000 men.
The largest military force ever assembled in European history up to that point.
And he expected to run his classic playbook, right?
He fully expected to use the exact same strategy that had conquered Italy, Austria, and Prussia, use the Corps d'Armée to move blindingly fast, force the Russian army into a massive, decisive battle within the first few weeks, shatter their forces, and dictate a peace treaty.
Quick and clean.
But the Russian commanders, particularly Barclay de Tolly and later Kutuzov, realized something profound. They couldn't beat him at his own game.
So they just refused to play it.
Exactly. They denied him the one thing his entire agile system required, a quick, decisive victory.
So what did they do instead?
The Russians simply retreated. They retreated deep into the vast, sprawling, freezing emptiness of the Russian landmass. And as they retreated, they utilized scorched earth tactics.
Which means?
They burned their own farms, poisoned their own wells, and destroyed their own villages.
Oh man, this completely breaks the mechanics of the Corps d'Armée. Because those speedboats we talked about, the small, fast-moving corps, part of the reason they could move so fast is because they didn't drag massive, slow supply trains of food with them, right?
Right. They lived off the land. They marched fast and pillaged local farms to feed themselves.
So the speed was reliant on local resources. But when you march a corps of 30,000 men into a Russian village and find nothing but ashes,
the speedboats start to starve. The logistics of feeding 600,000 men and hundreds of thousands of horses across a barren wasteland stretching hundreds of miles back to Poland were mathematically impossible.
is it too far?
Way too far. The horses died of starvation by the tens of thousands, which meant they had to abandon the artillery and the supply wagons. Typhus and dysentery just swept through the ranks.
The Russians literally inverted his own philosophy. Napoleon said, "Space we can recover, time, never." The Russians looked at their map and said, well, we have an infinite amount of space, let's trade our space to drain his time.
Yes.
They knew that if they bought enough time, the Russian winter would arrive.
And this is where the bulletproof ego becomes a fatal liability. Any rational commander seeing his horses dying, his men starving, and his supply lines stretched to the breaking point would have halted the advance and retreated to winter quarters in Poland.
Cut their losses.
Exactly. But Napoleon's ego prevented him from pivoting. He had never lost a major campaign. The illusion of his own invincibility was so complete that he genuinely believed his sheer will, his mere presence, could force reality to conform to his desires.
So it just kept going.
He pushed deeper and deeper, eventually capturing a burning, abandoned Moscow, just waiting for a surrender that never came.
He became a victim of his own myth. He actually believed his own PR. He spent all his time trying to conquer space in Russia. and the delay completely destroyed his army. By the time he finally ordered the retreat, the winter hit, and it was an apocalyptic horror show.
Truly horrific.
He went into Russia with over 600,000 men and came out with barely 100,000 effective troops.
That was a catastrophic failure of adaptation. He encountered a physical limit that simply could not be bypassed by emotional intelligence or rapid troop movements, and we see the final tragic culmination of this inability to adapt at Waterloo a few years later.
Because by the time we get to Waterloo, the magic trick has been fully exposed.
Precisely. His enemies had finally learned his playbook.
Yes.
They learned how to counteract the corps d'armée by coordinating their own massive armies. But more importantly, the psychological terror was gone.
The ore was broken.
After the disaster in Russia, the illusion of invincibility was shattered. The Allied troops at Waterloo were no longer paralyzed by the sight of his silhouette on the ridge. They knew he could bleed. Once that psychological leverage was gone, he was no longer a demigod bending reality. He was just a brilliant general fighting a vastly superior, numerically overwhelming force.
And math eventually wins.
You know, this historical analysis translates so perfectly into the present day. Because reading through these notes and comparing Napoleon's leadership style, his rise and his catastrophic fall, to the behaviors of modern technology CEOs, the parallels are frankly eerie.
The shared psychological traits are undeniable.
Think about the archetypes. Disrupting established legacy industries, that is Napoleon. Destroying the old aristocratic approach to war. Moving fast and breaking things, that is the literal definition of the corps d'armée, prioritizing speed and kinetic energy over traditional safe formations.
Completely.
Ignoring the old guard and crowning himself emperor instead of letting the Pope do it. That's the ultimate Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Lever the regulators move.
Yeah.
And possessing an extreme self-belief bordering on delusion. I mean, look at half the unicorn founders making headlines today.
It's true. The mindset required to build something massive completely out of nothing almost necessitates a degree of delusion. You have to possess an irrational belief that you can bend reality to your will, because the odds of success are so vanishingly small that a purely rational person wouldn't even try.
Right.
But the danger, as we see repeatedly with modern startups that burn through billions in venture capital only to crash spectacularly, is the exact same danger Napoleon faced in the Russian snow.
It's what happens when the move fast strategy hits a fundamental physical or economic limit.
Exactly. When a disruptive tech company hits a hard limit, whether it's a macroeconomic crash, a fundamental flaw in the physics of their product, or a regulatory wall they can't PR their way out of, the ego that built the company prevents the founder from acknowledging reality.
They just can't see it.
Right. Instead of pivoting or admitting defeat, they double down on the delusion. They believe that if they just push harder, if they just project enough confidence to the board of directors, they can force the world to comply.
So let's run a quick thought experiment. If Napoleon Bonaparte were alive today, in our modern world, with all his specific psychological traits and strategic brilliance, would he even bother with politics or the military? Or would he be the controversial founder of a disruptive tech unicorn? Imagine him wearing a highly specific signature hoodie, burning through billions in VC money, and promising to revolutionize artificial intelligence or colonize Mars.
It's a deeply fascinating hypothetical. I would argue that the arena of 19th century politics and military conquest was simply the most viable medium available to him at the time to exert his will.
That was the stage he had.
Right. His true underlying skill set was the rapid mobilization of resources, the absolute mastery of public perception, and the aggressive disruption of entrenched, inefficient systems. Today, the most frictionless environment for that specific set of skills is undoubtedly the technology sector.
So he's building an app.
Oh, he would absolutely be a unicorn founder. He would be brilliant. He would be highly controversial. His employee turnover and burnout rates would be horrific, but he would fundamentally change the architecture of whatever industry he targeted.
He would be on the cover of every magazine, heralded as a genius, and then eventually he would probably suffer a very dramatic, highly publicized board ousting when he refused to stop burning cash on a doomed, impossible project.
His own personal Waterloo, taking place in a boardroom instead of a muddy field in Belgium.
Wow. As we synthesize this entire journey for you, from the logistical brilliance of the speedboats, to the emotional intelligence of his battlefield presence, to the manipulation of art and branding, the core takeaways from our sources coalesce around a very specific truth about historical greatness.
They do. The ultimate lesson is that Napoleon's greatness, his permanent, unshakable place in human history, was not due to a flawless record of success.
Far from it. The catastrophic loss of life in Russia and the final crushing defeat at Waterloo proved that his system was deeply flawed, and his unchecked ego was ultimately his undoing.
His enduring legacy doesn't come from perfection. It comes from his sheer, unadulterated audacity.
Yeah.
It comes from his willingness to look at the entrenched, slow-moving, traditional world around him and completely redefine the rules of engagement. He looked at warfare and redefined it tactically with the speed and trust of the corps d'armée. He looked at leadership and redefined it psychologically by weaponizing his own image, his own bravery, and his own ego.
He understood, perhaps better than anyone else in his era, that humans are not strictly rational creatures. We were driven by emotion, we are captivated by symbols, and we are swept up by momentum.
And he mastered all three of those elements.
He proved that if you can conquer the mind, if you can inspire absolute, unquestioning devotion in your own team and induce absolute freezing paralysis in your competition, the actual physical conflict is just a formality. The war is already won.
It remains a masterclass in the immense power and the terrifying danger of charismatic leadership.
It really does.
Yeah.
And as you process all of this, as you think about your own career, the way you build your personal brand, the leaders you choose to follow, or the organizations you are a part of, there is a final lingering question we want to leave you with.
Yeah.
We spent this time dissecting the immense, world-bending power of projecting invincibility. But ask yourself this. When you build your entire life, your career, or your organization exclusively around a bulletproof ego and a cult of personality, what happens to everything you've built the exact moment that ego was finally shattered?
A very dangerous question to ignore.
Until next time, keep diving.